everybody, and thank you to the organizer for having me here. And yeah, it's such a responsibility to open the conference, so I hope I'll be fine. The analysis of the concept of identity in David Malouf's work is probably one of the most vexed questions in this other scholarship. If in fact the critics are unanimous or recognizes the problem of the establishment of identity as the crucial issue in Malouf's works, they address it from many different points of view, from post-colonial, such as, for example, Bliss or Randall or Archerlin. You can find a list at the back on your handout. And to gender and queer studies, as Ablett or Barlow, for example. So, about the author. Born in Brisbane, Australia, in 1934, to a Lebanese father and a British mother, British educated, Malouf has always tried to keep all the pieces of his identity together, with the purpose of reconciling them all. The most widely held critical position about Malouf is thus that he writes to find his own identity, which is to be independent of any other directed circumstances. My talk starts from this assertion to support an even more radical position. Analyzing his novel Ransom, appeared in 2009, and in general his poetics, I'm going to argue that Malouf's aim is to obliterate the concept of identity as fixed and socially imposed in order to promote fluidity and freedom. My argument is bipartite. First, I point out how Priam, Ransom's main character, tries to get out of his socially imposed role to become simply a man. In doing so, I use the sociologist and sociolinguistic Harvey Sachs membership categorization analysis, which he illustrates in his lectures on conversation. Such a theory explains how society classifies its members in categories, which are organized in sets of options. For example, the category nationality is composed of all the possible nationalities an individual can have. Furthermore, each member is expected to fit in at least one of these category sets, with no exceptions, and to behave accordingly to meet the expectations that society has from the set in which she or he fits. Such expectations are prescribed by a prioristic syllogisms. I will give you a few examples of that later. Then I'm going to apply this concept to the post-colonial context, reading the novel as an attempt to reject such categories as dominant, or dominator or dominated, winner or loser, in order to promote the more general concept of humanness. Speaking about the novel, Ransom rewrites and problematizes the Iliadic episode of Hector's ransom by his father Priam, who personally goes back Achilles. The novel expands the theme of the king's trip, giving him the opportunity to reflect on his own condition. The route to the Greek camp, therefore, mirrors Priam's personal journey from king to man, with the assistance of an exceptional companion, Somax the carter, purposely invented by Malouf. This man discloses the human world to Priam, who on the other hand has so far lived in a kingly world, now perceived as artificial. Priam's change, which culminates in the trip with Somax, is nevertheless anticipated in the previous chapters, where the king expresses his discontent. He is depicted from the very beginning as a tragical character, torn between the desire to live as a simple human and the duty to be a king, as we can read at point 1 of the handout. Priam says, "You ask me to stand, as I have always done, at a kingly distance from the human, which is my kingly role, as you say, I can have no part in. But I am also a father. Mightn't it be time for me to expose myself at last to what is merely human? To learn a little of what that might be and what it is to bear it as others do?" Priam is thus introduced to the reader as a character who is falling apart, since he is not able to balance his will with his duty. He claims his right to be a man, which is obscured by responsibilities as a king. This crisis can be interpreted, following Sachs' lead, as a clash of categories generated by Priam's desire to escape from his category-bound activity. As Sachs explains, some category sets, as the one which indicates the social position, which is the case, are characterized by some actions which their members are expected to perform only because they belong to this set. It is thus evident that the categories depend on a circular argument. Each person is expected to fit the category because she or he belongs to it. That means that the social behavior is protected against induction. Namely, it is built on always true statements, regardless if there are elements which contradict them. In other words, the social attitude towards categories is generally uncritical. In Priam's case, he is expected as a king not to feel emotions, whereas he is wrecked by his son's death. By representing his king falling apart, Malouf's aim is to challenge categorization. Priam is sick of meeting social expectations and wants to separate himself from his role. In this view, Ransom is the description of Pram's release from the king cliché, such as the destruction of the syllogism underlying it. Specifically, the major criticism is against the expectation from a king not to be emotional. Pram's subjects expect him to be a symbol rather than a real person, a duty which is always carried out until actor's death. That is the trigger to the total rethinking of Pram and his role, which turns out to be extremely objectifying, as the king himself states at point 2. To be seen as a man like other men, humans as we are, all of us, would have suggested that I was impermanent and weak. Better to stand still and keep silent, so that when old age came upon me, as it has at last, the world would not see how shaky my grip has become, and how cracked and thin my voice. Only that I'm still here, fixed and permanent, unchangeable, therefore unchanged. To others, I am what I've always been, great Pram, but only because they have never really looked at me. And when they do look, what they see is what they are meant to see. From the king's reflections, it emerges that he expected to be a mere symbol. In other words, what he represents is more relevant than what he actually is. In this view, he is obviously required to behave in the way that belongs to the category of kings. Specifically, he has to feel no emotions. Consequently, the syllogism within the social category of kings can be constructed as follows. All kings do not feel emotions. Pram is a king, so Pram does not feel emotions. By conforming with the shared view about the kingly attitude, Pram, in such words, is not accountable, which means that he does not need to account for his actions because they already meet the social expectations. Pram's position starts to be problematic when he decides to act against these patterns. He, who had been a symbol until that moment, decides to personally go carry home his son's corpse. From the moment he makes his decision, he acts against his category, with the consequence that he has to give explanations about his attitude. The result is that Pram is perceived as foolish, since he is no longer easily categorizable. A proof of this is given by his son's reactions, as we can read at point 3. But when they hear, with growing alarm, what the old man has in mind, they are filled with a misgiving that swells as the question sprang among them to outright consternation. How was he got hold of such a notion? It contradicts everything they have ever known of this grave and cautious figure who is their father. Challenges all they have ever demanded of the man, father or not, who is their king. The son's immediate reaction is to wonder about their father. In other words, they ask him an account for his actions exactly because this fall outside Pram's category. Moreover, the category of kingship is so all-encompassing that suppresses all other aspects of Pram's personality, since even his own children recognize him as the king and expect him to play his role. It is thus clear how strong the social pressure on Pram is. Being a king, he cannot act like a father, because it is reproachable to behave like one who belongs to a lower category. The clash between the two categories and Pram's consequent crisis can be easily explained by reconstructing the syllogism underlying the category of human. All humans feel emotions. Pram is a human. Pram feels emotions. It is thus evident that Pram cannot be both human and king. The novel is therefore thought as a journey that he undertakes to reconcile with his human side and rediscover what was hidden by his kingly positions. The reconciliation of Pram with his human side reaches its culmination during the journey with Somax. Thanks to the cutter, Pram rediscovers both his emotions and his body and starts feeling something again. Somax is thus a cathartic character, the trigger which starts Pram's transformation until his final revelation as a man before Achilles, as we can read at point 4. Achilles, he said, Pram speaking, his voice steady now. You know, as I do, what we men are. We are mortals, not gods. We die. Death is in our nature. Without that fee paid in advance, the word does not come to us. That is the hard bargain life makes with us, with all of us, everyone, and the condition we share. So, having overcome his own positions, he is now free to look beyond categories, as he eventually does with his enemy. At the end of the novel, as we can see, the categories of king and hero are totally deconstructed, and Achilles and Pram are depicted simply as man, a concept which, including all the other categories, automatically eliminates any difference between one category and another. So we have so far seen how Pram successfully overcomes the socially imposed categories in order to be simply a man. As I have stated at the beginning of my talk, this example can be fruitfully extended to the rejection of identity categories as a whole, which is one of the most recurrent themes in Malouf's works. He himself lived the problem of establishing an identity. As he states at point 5 in an interview, he says, in what way we stand, like other contemporary writers, at the end of a tradition, the tradition that goes back through the language we work in, English, to the Greeks and beyond. We live within a tradition with the same sense of lateness as Thurman Bernard or Thomas Pynchon or Italo Calvino or Georges Perec. But when it comes to the world that immediately surrounds us, we also stand in a curious telescoping of time at the beginning, in the positions they officiate, with the real making still to do. As an Australian, on the one hand, it feels like he has inherited another culture, namely the Western one, which is yet perceived as its end. On the other one, it feels the anxiety of Australia's relatively newsness, where everything still has to be done. A good example of this feeling is at point 6. Most Australians are still Europeans. They speak a European language, have European sensibilities, and they've created in Australia an imitation of Europe, which is also a new thing. But none of it, however beautiful it may be, quite fits with the natural environment. Malouf wants to fill the gaps between the European-like urban space and the wild nature which surrounds it, and which has nothing to do with Europe. In other words, he looks for a reconciliation between the European inherited culture and the Australian native one. He made an attack with an earlier antiquity-inspired novel, An Imaginary Life, which appeared in 1978. It tells about the exile of Ovid in Tomis, during which the poet meets a young savage and tries to educate him. The novel is built on Ovid's progressive rejection of such categories as conqueror or culturally superior, which he perceived as more and more oppressive. In the end, Ovid rejects his own education to merge with his surrounding nature, since he realizes how oppressive his Roman identity is. You can read it at point 7. The novel is clearly a way to overcome the categories of cultural dominancy and cultural submission, as it was in fact interpreted by most of the scholarship. So we can thus conclude that the theme of identity is persistent in Malouf's work, and so is the author's engagement and dialogue with the classical antiquity. Getting back to Ransom, I think it goes even further than An Imaginary Life, since Malouf uses this time the paramount work of Western literature to reconsider and ultimately reject the categories that the Iliad itself contributed to establish, not least the cultural supremacy one. Finally, it is worth noting that Malouf has always strived for the creation of an Australian mythology, as he explains at point 8. So we are therefore entitled to think that he rewrote the first epic poem of his inherited culture as a reminder that there are no winners and losers, kings or heroes, but just man, sharing, as his poem eventually finds out, the very same condition, namely humanness. In conclusion, by representing a king who tries to break free from kingship, Malouf points out how artificial and oppressive categories are. They create a hierarchy which ultimately prevents humans from being happy. He thus uses the Iliad, the poem about war, other than the work which established the concept of hero, to rewrite an alternative mythology and promote the human communion. So, by rewriting the Iliad, Malouf gets straight to the heart of Western culture and tries to change its assumption, providing as a result a fresh start to his inherited culture. Thank you.